So, welcome back to the quantitative finance course, to the nth number of lecture. So, we were in the last class just started the concept of swap. Swap means in English word exchange, some sort of exchange. So, now the swap is basically a type of financial product or a derivative which is basically being designed in order to mitigate the overall risk two parties faced on two different fronts. So, as we were discussing, swaps would be considered here in our course based on two fronts. One is the risk based on interest rate and one is the risk based on foreign currency, and obviously you can combine them accordingly. So, coming back to the swap, for the example which we were considering, there is Microsoft. It needs chips from Intel, and Intel also wants to sell them at some future date in time, and based on that they want to basically go for a swap. Swap means a type of financial transaction such that they are able to mitigate or reduce the overall risk. So, here we are using a swap to transform our liability. So, suppose Microsoft has arranged to borrow, as we are discussing, 100 millions at LIBOR rate. LIBOR rate is, again I am reiterating, is the London interbank offer rate. Similarly, you have the Mumbai interbank offer rate. So, LIBOR plus 10 basis points. So, the interest rate to be paid by Microsoft based on the borrowing money is LIBOR plus 0.1%. After MS has gone into a swap, it has the following three sets of transactions. So, what are the transactions we will consider? So, the first one is it pays LIBOR plus 1.2 outside lender. So, now what initially, if you remember, I have discussed, this is Intel and this is Microsoft. So, if there was no third party, no financial institution in between, the amount of transaction would have taken between these two. But the problem is that each faces a risk. In case one defaults, the overall risk is totally faced by the other party. If Microsoft defaults, everything rests on Intel, how is able to overcome the risk. In case Intel defaults, then all the risk goes on to Microsoft. So, obviously, both the parties won't want this. So, what they would do is that they would go simultaneously with a third party outside. So, this is what I am trying to discuss. It pays LIBOR plus 0.1% to an outside lender. So, this is the outside lender. It receives LIBOR under terms of contract which is already signed with Intel. So, obviously, the LIBOR contract is between Intel and Microsoft, and it pays under the term of contract which is already signed with Intel. So, the second and the third point are these two transactions. So, it receives, Microsoft basically receives LIBOR and it gives 5%, and also it gives to the third party, which is the first point, is basically the LIBOR plus 0.1%. So, if you consider the overall transaction for Microsoft, it will be LIBOR plus 1% to the outside person. That means, arrow coming inside is LIBOR and arrow going outside is basically 5%. So, these are the three transactions from the point of view of Microsoft, such that it has been able to convert the liabilities from what? That is the main question. From, if you see, it pays LIBOR. So, LIBOR is going out plus 0.1, LIBOR is also coming in. So, LIBOR cancels. So, what you actually have would be a fixed rate of 5% plus 0.1%. So, what is actually happening is the floating interest rate which was being paid is now being converted into a fixed interest rate from the point of view of Microsoft. Now, consider that Intel's point of view. So, what was Intel doing and what it is now doing, they would be two different scenarios, and again you will see this is the same implication as we saw in the just last slide for Microsoft. Suppose Intel has arranged to borrow 100 millions at 5.2%, and after Intel has gone to a swap, it has the following three transactions. So, again we have Intel, we had Microsoft with an outside party. So, this scenario we have already covered in the last slide. So, now we will consider these three, where this will also be considered for the second time, this will be considered again for the second time, and there would be a third party which Intel will now consider. So, this was Intel and this was Microsoft. So, this red one, this whole thing which I have just erased, we have already considered. Now we are going to consider the green circle and the corresponding transactions. So, what are these transactions? Intel pays 5.2% to the outside party, which is the first transaction which is here. It pays LIBOR under the terms of the contract which is signed with Intel, which is this contract. It pays and it receives 5% under the term of the contract from Microsoft. So, this is the one. So, now if you consider all the three transactions cumulatively, what you have is LIBOR is there plus going and coming, some amount is going out, some amount is coming in. What is going out? 5.2% is going out and it receives 5%. So, the net outflow is 0.2 plus the LIBOR which is already there, which means Intel is technically able to convert its old position from a fixed rate to basically a floating rate, where the floating rate is now LIBOR plus some basis points. And what is that basis point? That basis point is 0.2%. So, we see Microsoft was more than willing to convert its position from a floating to a fixed, which we saw that in the last slide, and now Intel has been more than willing to convert its position from a fixed to a floating, which we have just done. Now, there is a difference here. In the initial stage, the parties were only two, Microsoft and Intel. So, in order to convert their floating to a fixed and fixed to a floating, we bought two other players into the market. One is Microsoft with a third party, and the second instance is basically Intel and the third party. So, the last two slides basically discuss that. But still, if you consider Microsoft and Intel are dealing amongst themselves only, which means in case there is a default by Microsoft, then the whole amount of risk is passed on to Intel and vice versa. This part we have not considered yet, even though the swap has been done in such a way that the position from a fixed to a floating, floating to a fixed has been converted, still the overall risk still remains. So, the question which all of you would be asking is that how do we do that? So, now what we will do is that in the last stage of the transaction, what is there, where there is Intel as shown, Microsoft as shown, plus through third parties, one for Microsoft, one for Intel, will slowly bring a fourth party into the scenario, which is the financial institution. So, as we bring the financial institution into the focus, obviously it would mean two things. Number one, overall risk for Microsoft, which it is facing from Intel, or the overall risk which Intel is facing from Microsoft would be shared and taken care by the financial institution, point one. Point two, if financial institution is willing to take up the risk, then it should matter that how that overall risk is being partitioned between these two players, such that the financial institution makes some profit in lieu of the overall risk it is going to face for both the parties. So, here third parties are not there into the consideration. We are only considering a financial institution in between, along with the fact that Microsoft and Intel is already there, and each of them, that is Microsoft and Intel, has its own third party already into the picture. Now, we will basically use a swap to transform an asset. So, I will come to the concept of Microsoft, this financial institution later on. So, let us consider go one by one and basically try to analyze the problem in its first stage of swaps, and then slowly bring the Microsoft this financial institution in the picture. Now, suppose Microsoft owns again the same problem, owns 100 millions in bonds that will provide interest rate of 4.7% per annum. This is risk free interest rate per annum. Over the next 3 years, afterwards Microsoft enters into a swap and has the following three sets of transaction. What are the transaction? It receives 4.7 on the bonds, it receives LIBOR on the terms of the contracts, it pays 5%. So, if you consider the overall scenario, 4.7 receives LIBOR, pays 5%, which means the overall interest rate which is being paid by Microsoft would be basically now a floating interest rate, because LIBOR is there, plus and minus the overall difference in the fixed interest rate which is there. That means, it receives 4%, it gives 5%. So, the overall difference is basically 0.03% plus the LIBOR which is already there. Consider Intel, again the same thing. Now, initially it was only LIBOR minus 20 basis points. So, now Intel enters into a swap which has three different components. One is LIBOR minus 20 basis point. So, initially let me recapitulate again, initially it was only LIBOR minus basis points. So, which means that Intel was going into a floating interest only. Now, in the second scenario it does is basically receives LIBOR minus 20%, which is same, but also pays LIBOR and receive 5%. So, if you consider this LIBOR and this LIBOR, they would cancel out. So, you have 20 basis point minus plus 5% it receives. So, the overall interest rate is being changed from a floating to a fixed for Intel case, and in the last slide we saw that in the case of Microsoft it was being changed from a fixed to a floating interest rate. Fixed in the sense there was no floating or LIBOR concept, but it brought into the picture the concept of LIBOR. So, hence Intel was able to change its position from a floating to a fixed or fixed to a floating, depending on whatever is advantageous for it. And similarly Microsoft would also do the same thing. In case if floating was advantageous, it will convert from fixed to a floating or vice versa, depending on the situation it is facing. So, this was the basic scenario. Company A was there, 5% was being paid to company B was basically paying LIBOR. So, obviously it would mean that company A or company B may be advantageous to convert this floating to a fixed or fixed to a floating. So, we have to basically check the context of the problem and then decide which is better for which company. So, here now till now in this example which you are seeing, there is two boxes A, company A and company B. There are no third parties, there are no financial institution. Now, consider two third parties come. So, if you compare with the last slide and this slide, what you see is that company B was basically giving 5% and getting LIBOR. Now, it gives LIBOR plus some basis point to a third party. So, for company B, if you consider, the overall scenario is this: LIBOR cancels. So, now what you actually have is 5% plus 0.8%, which is going out from company B. So, company B is now changing its position from a floating to a fixed rate. Now, what about A? If you compare the overall transaction, it is basically initially it was only getting 5%. Now, if you consider the LIBOR and the 5%, it is basically now converting its position from a fixed to a floating, because LIBOR is already there. LIBOR plus 0.2%, which is also going. So, obviously company B would be paying LIBOR plus 0.2 and company A would be paying 5 plus 0.8, which is fixed in the case of company B. Now, consider the third scenario where you have now brought a financial institution. Now, company B, if you consider, is no longer interacting with A, or A is no longer interacting with B. The financial institution which is in between is now able to take care of the overall risk that company A is facing from B or company B is facing from A, such that the overall risk is being shared by FI. How? If you consider only company B, so obviously the transactions are this. So, LIBOR cancels, the overall percentage is 5.015 going outside to FI and 0.58% going to the this third party. So, overall interest rate going out from company B is only fixed, which is 5.015 plus 0.8 percentage. Now, for company A, if you considered, the third party was already there. So, now it is interacting not with B, but with the financial institution which is in between, but the interest rates have changed. In what way? So, now initially it was a fixed case for A, now it is a floating case for A. How? If you add up all these three, LIBOR is going out and the extra percentages which is going out over and above the LIBOR would be 5.2 minus 4.985. So, overall company A has converted its position from a fixed to a floating, while company B has converted its position from a floating to a fixed. Now, if you compare this scenario, this is case 3 if you note, and if you compare the last slide which is case 2, you will see there is a subtle difference. If you compare the overall risk being paid or obtained by A or paid or obtained by B, there is a difference. So, if you consider the overall scenario for company B, in this case, case 2, it is LIBOR minus LIBOR, these are cancelling out. What are cancelling out? These two, and the overall one is 5 percentage plus 0.8. So, the overall value which is going out for company B is 5.08. So, with this let us go back to the other slide. So, let us write 5.8. Now, if you consider this, here LIBOR plus LIBOR minus cancels and it is 5.015 plus 0.8. So, the overall becomes 5.815. So, if you compare this and this, the overall difference is 0.015, which is the extra one which is being paid by company B. Similarly, you can find out for A, if you go back to the last slide, it is LIBOR plus 0.2, here it is LIBOR plus 0.2 is for the last example, here it will be LIBOR plus 5.2 minus 4.985. If you find out this, you will find out the value is a little bit more than 0.2. So, now overall interest rate being paid by A is of definitely still remains a floating rate, but the floating rate has increased. So, here initially it was LIBOR plus 0.2, now it is LIBOR plus some value which you can find out the difference between them. Now, you will say where did this difference of 0.015 and the difference from this in both these cases. So, overall extra percentage which is being paid by B with respect to scenario 2 and 3 is 0.015 and the extra interest rate being paid by A is this difference. Where did it vanish? So, obviously, this extra must have been taken by somebody. So, let us see only concentrate on the FI. So, what is happening for the FI? LIBOR cancels, 5.015 is coming in, 4.985 is going out. So, overall is 5.015 minus 4.985. If you see this difference would be equally shared by A and equally shared by B. So, the overall percentage difference is being now shared by A and B in such a way that the overall risk is increasing in quantum sense, but the risk actually is not being taken care by either A or B, because if there is a default by A, FI is there to take care for B, and if there is a default by B, FI is there to take care from the point of view of A. So, in whichever default is there, the FI is there definitely there to take care of the other risk, but obviously it has to be compensated. That compensation is coming in equal proportions from A, equal proportions from B, such that the overall risk is extra profit is this one. So, swaps usually the two entities do not come into touch with each other directly in order to arrange for the swap. They deal between themselves through financial intermediary, as I just discussed, such that as a bank or other FI. The concept of comparative advantage is very important for a swap. So, when you are converting your position of a liability or to asset, or asset to a liability, or you are converting your position from a fixed to a floating to a fixed interest rate, or you are converting your position from a rupee to dollar to rupee to yen, or rupee to yen to rupee to dollar, or a combination of that. Combination means you are facing risk from both perspective of interest rate as well as foreign currency. So, here it should be thought about that what is the comparative advantage two parties would get, such that it really makes sense for both of them to change their position, such that the overall swap can be brought into the place, considering there is a financial institution which is able to take care of the overall risk in lieu of some percentage of profit which has to be shared equally by both the players. So, that means if there are two equal players A and B, A would give some percentage of the profit to FI and B would give the same percentage of profit to the FI, such that the FI makes some profit in the overall transaction. For the case when the company wants to change its assets into a liability or a liability to an asset in its overall understanding and undertaking, so it has to basically analyze where does it basically make a competitive advantage. So, is it competitive advantage to convert from floating to a fixed or vice versa. So, this concept of competitive advantage is true for the case when we consider an interest rate swap only. Competitive advantage would also be there, in the case of currency. So, we have to see in the currency perspective which currency is basically making some competitive advantage for player A or for player B. Based on that, we will make a swap based on the concept of currency swap only. The concept of competitive advantage, as I was saying, for the currency, for the case when a company wants to change its asset into a liability or liability into an asset, it is undertaken with the notion that it has some competitive advantage either in the domestic currency or in the foreign currency. So, this concept of competitive advantage is, for this case which we will consider later on, is considered as the currency swap in the currency swap only, and we will consider them separately depending on the competitive advantage and disadvantage for two players who are coming into a swap. So, the concept of competitive advantage would be basically there are 4 different type concepts. One is floating interest rate being converted to a fixed to a floating. So, these are 2 scenarios, and a domestic currency being converted to a foreign currency or a foreign currency being converted to a domestic currency. So, there are another 2. So, 2 into 2, 4 different transactions would be dealt with us in this simple manner. Obviously, they can be other type of risk also. So, we are not going to consider other type of risk and let our discussion be limited to the currency rate swaps only and the interest rate swaps only. So, consider this: company A has fixed of 4% and floating of LIBOR plus 0.3. So, this is only based on the interest rate. Company B has 5.2 and LIBOR of plus 1%. So, let us pause and look at this. The difference between company B and A is 1.2 on the fixed rate, and difference between company A and B is basically the LIBOR cancels is basically 0.7%. So, if I consider company B is paying more in both the cases, that is true, but it is facing a huge amount of risk from the point of view of fixed case, because it is paying an extra amount of interest rate which is 1.2 over A. But if I consider the floating one, the overall extra interest rate it is going to pay is 0.7. So, if I compare these 2 statements, it would mean both companies wish to borrow the same amount for 5 years period. So, time is basically being brought into the picture in order to understand how the swap, if you draw the matrix, would come into the picture. Principal amount, notional amount is 100 millions and have been offered the rates as shown in the previous slide. We assume that B wants or has to borrow at a fixed rate, while A has or wants to borrow in the floating rate. So, obviously, if B goes for a fixed rate, it is facing a disadvantage with respect to a floating case, while if A wants to do that, it is just facing the other way type of disadvantage. So, see that the difference between the 2 fixed rate is greater than the corresponding difference between the floating rate from the point of view of B. So, if that is the case, B pays 1.2 more than in A in the fixed rate and 0.7 more than A in the floating rate. So, this appears to imply that B has a competitive advantage in the floating rate market and A has a competitive advantage in the fixed rate market. So, this apparent anomaly based on what is their advantage and what they have to do has to be basically brought into reality into the picture. So, this apparent anomaly can lead to a swap agreement between these 2 parties. How? Let us see. Now, the swap is like as discussed, even though practically this is not the case, we will just consider a simple theoretical case. Assume A and B get in touch with each other, A agrees to pay 4% to the outside lender, it receives 3.95 and it pays LIBOR to B, which means that in the overall case the interest rate is still floating, but the still floating is being done in such a way that it is basically getting the competitive advantage with respect to that case when it was basically dealing on its own. Now, what does point company B do? Assume A and B again get together. I am considering the other scenario. B agrees to pay LIBOR plus 1% to the outside lender as per the table which you have already seen. It receives LIBOR, say for example from A, it pays 3.95 to B. So, obviously, LIBOR cancels, which means that company B has been able to convert its position in such a way that is basically converting its fixed to a floating or a floating to a fixed. Now, the swap is through a FI and we have the falling flow transaction from the point of view of A after A and B get in touch together, but obviously it can be done for the case of B to A also. So, with this I will take a break and consider the more details between the financial institution and the A and B, considering the competitive advantage they are facing, and continue in the next class. Thank you.